The Paul Leslie Hour, helping people tell their stories. And now, your host, Paul Leslie.
Usually we get right into the show, but I just wanted to take a moment to talk to you all. The show is now in its 16th year. Thank you all for being here. A number of you have said that you would like to support the show. Well, now you can. If you've ever gotten enjoyment, inspiration, or information, consider becoming a patron. Just go to patreon.com/The Paul Leslie Hour. Hey, it's me. Ladies and gentlemen, at the moment, I'm on the patio of There in Brookhaven, Atlanta, Georgia. We are here at There, and it's just a beautiful evening. We're at the very last days of summer, I guess you could say, technically now fall. I'm sitting here with Jeff Calder. He's a singer, songwriter, recording artist, performer, guitarist, saxophonist, producer, also a freelance writer, and best known as the main songwriter for the visionary pop group The Swimming Pool Cues. And on a personal note, I'm a big fan of The Swimming Pool Cues and of your songwriting. I've often said that the album, The Royal Academy of Reality, is one of the best sounding albums I've ever heard. And very unique in terms of the songs on there. So, Jeff Calder, thank you very much for making the time.
Well, thank you, Paul. That record took a long time to make, and I think you only get maybe one of those records in your life. But, it took quite a while to make at a time when that's basically an analog record, which was quite an undertaking anyway, without any real money or much money. But the kind of, it was a foolhardy endeavor to try to make a record like that at that time without any. Today it would be much easier to make because of the expansive recording of digital of Pro Tools and so forth. But I think one of the reasons it sounds unique is because that it is an analog record, and there is, this the kind of precision that would happen today was not totally available there, other than the precision of the recording engineer Phil Hadaway, with whom I co-produced the record. He is a great recording engineer, and so that helped. But I think the kind of there's a muted aspect to a lot of the record. That's I think because that it is not it doesn't have quite the precision of a modern digital recording, even though in some ways it sounds like one, because it's a good sounding record.
Yeah. Would you say that in terms of your own creative expression, is the heights of creativity found in the recording studio, or is it found on stage?
Well, I'd say early on it would have been with the Swimming Pool Cues. We started in the late 1970s. I would say that's where, in the recording studio, in the rehearsal space and in the live context, when we were learning to be a band, learning to play as a group. I didn't really have any experience with that. Before I started the Swimming Pool Cues, I'd never been in a band, although certainly around a lot of rock music at that point. But that's where we developed all of the early stuff that we did, and I'd make small, like little demos. Mm-hmm. But, we played all the time. But the Swimming Pool Cues, when we began, we rehearsed almost every night of the week for several hours, and we, from the beginning, had a pretty intensive performing schedule. And so we'd find ourselves in situations where we had to improvise and just to get through, a lot of club experiences. So I think that's where that was. But it took years really before we were able to look at the recording studio as anything other than something to be feared, you know. And then, but I would say now it would be completely different. You know, I've had so much recording experience, not just with the swimming pool cues, but, you know, around, many other projects. And I helped to manage a recording studio here in Atlanta called Southern Tracks in the 2000 decade. And when Brendan O'Brien, the rock producer, was making a lot of records here at that studio, and it was a world-class facility. So, you know, even before then I was comfortable in a recording studio, but that really became my life in a lot of ways. So I don't really, I don't feel intimidated by the technology of it all anymore. And I feel more comfortable and more creative in a recording situation.
So I think most stories are best from the beginning. Tell us, where did your personal story begin? Where were you born?
I was born in Charleston. I grew up there in the 1950s. Very kind of romantic, poetic childhood, because that's the way that the place was. It was a remote, in many ways, a remote place at that time. You know, had a troubled past, but it was there was the portal that I had to the outside world was a great radio station called WTMA, AM radio station that what played. It was just a great radio station. This was in the late 50s, early 60s, and so I from a pretty early age I was someone who was very much into music. And pursued finding out everything that I could about music. You know, I'm 8 years old, 9 years old, pursuing every. At the time, there was not really the kind of media that later developed in the rock world. You know, Rolling Stones. So there was nothing like that at that time. So you had to really you had to want it. To just find out about the artists that you liked. And so that's really where my interest in music began. But I didn't really have any kind of, I couldn't play an instrument. I didn't play an instrument when I was a very young person. My family moved to Florida, Central Florida in 1964. And it was a very different world, even though it was still the South, you know. Florida and the South was the heyday of the space age. So, you know, Florida was seen, by comparison to Charleston, which was like, you know, growing up in the 1700s and with automobiles. Florida was much more modern in its, the roads were new. The I-4 corridor, what we think of now as the I-4, that was a new road then. The suburbs were, all the post-World War II suburbs were new, really. Schools were great. You know, it was a somewhat different world, and it was also a place where the music in that Central Florida corridor at that time, which would have been the mid '60s, was fantastic. Promoters ran national and groups of international renown and through that area all the time. I guess the bands wanted to play there. So I was, you know, Florida must have sounded appealing to them, even though the Central Florida that you and I know was, well, Orlando was a cattle town.
Yeah.
Citrus, phosphate pits. I mean, it wasn't necessarily glamorous and, you know, all Apollo 11 or whatever, but it was for a reason it was appealing to a lot of artists play. So when I was a teenager, you know, we saw great bands, the Yardbirds, the Buffalo Springfield, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the Dave Clark Five. You could just anything. You could just name about anybody in it. So that was that's something that would never have happened where I grew up in Charleston. They never would have. Artists like that would never have come through. Of that stature would never have come through there. So that was very fortunate for me to be around that. And I knew a lot of great musicians from the area. So even though I didn't play an instrument, I was around that a lot. I went to school for a year. It's a bit of an anomaly. I went to school for a year in Macon at Mercer University in 1969. I didn't really like Macon very much, but the Allman Brothers were essentially a local band at that point. And I was exposed to the Atlanta underground music scene, which was the most impressive of any city in the South even at that time. So there was an underground famous newspaper from Atlanta called radical paper called The Great Speckled Bird. We were able to get that paper at Mercer University, and I was able to become aware of the music scene that had developed here, the creative music scene at that time. One of the bands was the Hampton Grease Band that came and performed at the school, and I just thought it was an extremely avant-garde rock band, and they were from from here. So that kind of a band could have existed, here, or really anywhere in the South, was a shock to me. And not that there weren't fine rock bands in Florida, but that was a really artistic rock group. So much later, I would get to know the musicians in that group, particularly Glenn Phillips. Through Glenn, over the course of the 1970s, I was still living in Florida as a freelance writer. I met the members of the Swimming Pool Cues, who would become the members of the Swimming Pool Cues. Bob Elsey, who's a great, still a teenager, wonderful guitar player, and Ann Richmond Boston. And I got to meet them through the Hampton Grease Band, through Glenn of the Hampton Grease Band. And then later, much later than that, in 1996, I was the reissue supervisor for their album, Music to Eat, which was, a real, a breakthrough record, to me anyway. Mm-hmm. And it was an important record to the Atlanta music world, just for the sheer creativity of it and the inspiration that it had, I believe, for local artists to be, to not worry about being anything much other than original. And I think really that paves the way for the development of the new wave and punk worlds here. Just general atmosphere over the course of the earlier part of the 1970s. I think that really paves the way for Atlanta, and of course Athens being so receptive to a burgeoning art music, new wave world later in the 1970s. That's really where we came from. Mm-hmm. I'd gone to the University of Florida in the early 70s. I was an English student. I studied with, I was in the novelist Harry Cruz's creative writing class. He wasn't that well known at the time, but later became a famous writer.
Oh, yeah.
And he was a great teacher. He was very funny. And he, my idea of what a writer was, I wanted to be a writer. So it was not Harry Cruz, but being around him was and big, so really energizing. He was a writer. He got up every day, wrote, published. It was like, I can't say that I really had known a writer before then. But anyway, that was the early 1970s. And at Gainesville at the time had a very strong rock music world with the band Tom Petty's and the Heartbreakers, proto Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers band, and a number of other groups. But it was a kind of an exciting little rock scene, like college town rock scene. And so anyway, I left school there in 1973, and for the whole middle 70s, I was a freelance rock writer living in Central Florida, which means I didn't really do much of anything at all. But I had, I got to, I was serious about it, and I'd always wanted to have a rock band, but, like I said, I really had to sort of teach myself how to play the guitar so I could nobody was going to, I was the word guy, right? I was the guy with, who's going to do the word, you don't, nobody wanted the word guy, it was, I'm just sort of standing on the sidelines, and it was hard to convince anybody to like start a band or whatever. It was only a city like Atlanta at that time where you could find musicians that would want to be part of that, and also to have any kind of an audience for what you're doing. And I eventually moved here. But before that, in the mid 70s, I was a good rock writer, and I knew, and I was serious about it. And I'd been to New York several times. I'd done some freelance stringing for Charles M. Young, who was Rolling Stone's, the best writer Rolling Stone had after Hunter Thompson, the Hunter Thompson era. And he was the only writer at Rolling Stone that really was into the punk and new wave music. He did the first profiles of, big profiles of the emerging new wave groups. And I knew Lester Bangs and a lot of the writers who were the kind of leading lights. That was a field that was very exciting at that time, And in the case of Lester Bangs, it was somebody who I think really was using a rock music as a platform for just being a writer, and as opposed to being simply a rock writer. It was a vibrant period for that. I eventually went another direction and decided to move to Atlanta and start the Swimming Pool Cues.
So take us back to coming to Atlanta. I know just in the last 10 years, Atlanta has changed so much. What were you seeing? What was it like through your eyes? What were you feeling when you moved here?
Well, I had $75, and I moved into a garage in Brookhaven, probably just only about 4 minutes from here. The garage of my friend Bill Ray's house. Bill is like a virtuoso fretless bass player who has played with Glenn Phillips for decades, and so I knew Bill, and I stayed in this garage with a dirt floor for the first year that I was here. But it was just a really exciting period of time, because when I moved here, I didn't really know that there was any. There were only a handful of bands that you would have thought were like new wave or punk or post-punk bands, more than any other city in the South. But nevertheless, it was a relatively small scene, looking back, but it was a committed, world, and there were so many great bands at that time. There was The Brains, which had my friend Tom Gray was the main songwriter for The Brains. They had a hit with Money Changes Everything. Cyndi Lauper later recorded the song, and it was a great kind of electronic rock group. The Fans, within Atlanta, a lot of groups that were the Basics. A dozen bands, but also we didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about an Athens music scene that was emerging. So when I arrived here, the B-52s were just starting to get some renown, and eventually by the end of the decade, you began to see Pylon, Love Tractor, and REM, and all those sorts of things. So it was a really unique situation to walk into, and the Swimming Pool Cues. We became a major part of that. At that world, and within less than a year, we were playing whatever clubs would let a new wave or a punk band in. There weren't many, but we were playing local venues. But we were also opening. Our first gig was in June of 1978, And by December of that year, we'd played with the B-52s. We opened for Devo at the Agora Ballroom, a great venue. And, you know, we were playing with national acts. So, I mean, it was like, you know, at least for somebody like me who'd never even been on stage before, that was a pretty big, I mean, you just had to kind of do it. You know, you didn't really know we didn't really know what we were doing. But we did start out, we were a band that really pursued playing regionally at a time when that was, not, anything that was practical at all. Because there was no regional punk or new wave circuit. But we were fortunate and just sort of like bullheaded, and we kind of put together in Florida, sat in the Carolinas, and so forth. We put together I guess kind of a circuit like that, where one didn't exist. And for the first few years of the Swimming Pool Cues, we played with many great artists. We toured the South with the Police in the spring of 1979, played a half dozen dates, with them. And, it was then, that you could see that, there is actually a possibility that you could, really do this, because there were people coming to the shows. Mm-hmm. And so that really gave us a lot of momentum, and eventually put our first record out in 1981, first album, I should say. And that was The Deep End.
Right. Now, when you think about the Swimming Pool Cues and their sound now, how would you describe to the listeners how the sound has changed going from the Deep End to now?
Well, the Deep End, all of the early material we did was, probably because I was a writer, it was a lot of the early material was very satirical. It was funny. It was, had an edge to it. And, we were satirizing the world around us. But by the time we make our first major label record in 1984, which is called the Swimming Pool Cues, there's already a big change has taken place, because, as a songwriter, I went from somebody who, pursued this other thing to somebody who was writing songs for a female voice as well. Those songs had a different personality, and I had to learn how to do that. They were more melodic, and they had a great deal more emotional content. And that's something that I didn't really know much of anything about. I mean, that's usually where rock musicians start. Mm-hmm. That isn't, that wasn't me. I became more of a songwriter that was interested in that. But, most songwriters and rock musicians I know, they start from at least I knew during that era, they started from a point of view of, you talking about Tom Petty in early 70s, all of the musicians I knew in Florida were like that. They were, he was a very soulful singer. Mm. And all of the musicians that came out of the 60s, and rock musicians, 60s and 70s, they had a real strong component. There was no reason for them to be doing what they were doing other than to project this feeling. That wasn't me. So I had to, eventually, over the course of the first 5 years of the Swimming Pool Cues, as I was developing this songs for Ann Boston to sing, I became more of that kind of a songwriter, and I guess a conceptualist, or whatever my role happened to be. So that's where you see the transition of the Swimming Pool Cues. And then leaping forward and, say to the Royal Academy, Across the Blue Tomorrow in 1986, which is a very cerebral record, to Royal Academy of Reality, which came out in 2003, I think.
Yeah.
That record, you can see there is a more of a cerebral and poetic intention. It's not that wasn't there in the very early days. Like on the Deep End, there are tracks like The A-Bomb Woke Me Up, Overheated, and that are that way, more that way. But by the time, leaping across decades, I think that it's fair to say that we're much more of a cerebral kind of band, I suppose. I mean, I don't know how would you describe the Royal Academy of Reality? I mean, it's, what I'm talking about, but I don't know that.
Definitely
it's a lush record. And really the origins of that are with our experience making our album Blue Tomorrow in 1986, which was for a band like the Swimming Pool Cues, it was shocking that we were working with a British producer that we made a 48-track record, which, at the time was like, what is that? What? I mean, major artists weren't working in that kind of expanded format. And so, what we learned making that, all the things we learned making that record in 1986, we were able to eventually take advantage of those skills by the time we made the Royal Academy of Reality, which we started maybe in 1993, something like that, recording. So I think that is pretty much, I don't know if anybody listening to that, what I just said, would have any idea what if that describes our evolution.
I definitely would say, you could find poetry in the first recordings, but you're right. I would think of the Royal Academy of Reality album as far more poetical. Is poetical a word?
Yes, it is.
It is. Okay. I have to ask, because when I was thinking of these...
But I should say that was all there by our first A&M record, because there you really see Ann Boston beginning to emerge and as a real force, a great singer, and the songs that she sang were, they dealt with I think that they were, there was a real language factor there that, and trying to make these the somewhat complicated lyrically, and try to make them, trying to get that across melodically. That was the real challenge for the band at that point. And when you look at songs like Some New Highway from that record, and Purple Rivers, Silver Slippers that she sang, those are, were real, very challenging. And I think that anyway, that's really, in that period of time, that's where you see that, I think you can see the point of departure for the Swimming Pool Cues.
This might be a difficult question. If you had to pick a song that you wrote that you would say is your strongest work, which one would it be?
Well, addressing what I was just mentioning from that period of time, I really like Wreck Around from Blue Tomorrow. I think that was a real strong piece of work. That was a breakthrough track for us. And it was I think that was a really good piece of work. And it had all of the, it was what we were trying to do, which was, not easy. That record, the prior record we made with, a great production team. Ed Stasium as the engineer and associate producer, who I should mention that I'm still working with recently on a project we can talk about, but and the great David Anderley, who was the producer who had signed the band to A&M. He was somebody that went back to he worked with the Beach Boys. He had signed the Mothers of Invention to MGM. He had worked with he'd set up the Beach Boys record company, Brother Records. He was a major figure in West Coast rock music world of the 1960s. And that was a great production team. But with Mike Howlett, who was a British producer, the kind of record that Blue Tomorrow was not a record that American rock bands at the time made. And because it was really important in the world in which we moved to constantly be demonstrating authenticity, kind of a street, streetish kind of punk vibe that was, it just seemed like the band was going in the studio and, playing just like the way they did live. And, you didn't want to dress it up too much. You were always subject to charges of overproduction, so on and so forth. And we just sort of threw all that out the window with that record. And that was, for me, that was a really good thing because, it was at that point, it was like, hey, when you go in the studio to make a record, you're making a record. You're not, it isn't like you're at the Roadhouse, and we didn't really know how to do that. That's what that's kind of what we learned with that record, that you're making an album. You're not simply documenting how you are as a band. I mean, I think the record has plenty of energy, but it's like, that was and that is, one of the reasons we were able to make the Royal Academy a reality many years later is that we knew we were making a record. But I think, at the same time, I think making records with just, documenting how a band is live, that's there are many different ways to make an album. And I think that there's not one that's more valid or better than another. I think taking the group in and recording the first take of every track and just, that's that's totally legitimate to me. But on the other hand, you have to learn to make records this other way. And that's simply the product of experience, I think, and in time. It's like, I think what I'm saying.
There's one song from the Swimming Pool Cues that the first time I heard it, I've just always been enchanted. And I'm hoping you can tell me what inspired The Wheel of the Sun. Love that song.
Well, that's an interesting track in that Mo Tucker plays the drum, or the Velvet Underground plays the drum on. I was going to say drums. She plays the drum on that track. That song is like that's an example of the poetic side of that record. That's like Lucretius on the nature of things from, I don't know when that book, in the early, like 200 AD or whatever, whenever that book was written. But On the Nature of Things is a book of, it's one of the great masterpieces of expressions of our civilization. And it's about the natural world. Lucretius didn't believe in God. He didn't, he was something like an atheist today. But, he believed in the natural world, and that long poem is his, this is Lucretius's version of what reality is. And The Wheel of the Sun is a recording that is very much in that mode of expression, I think. And what else about it? I can't, it has a double harpsichord solo.
Yes. Which you don't hear all the time.
No, you don't hear it. And believe me, I can remember recording it like it was yesterday, and it was not, it was quite a challenge, And that we had a local bagpipe player come in. He was a terrific guy. And he insisted on, he showed up in the kilt, the whole bit, right? And to play the bagpipe. And you forget forget about trying to tune a bagpipe. You know, they're like, they don't have the same kind of scale as a regular instrument. So you just have to keep recording as many tracks as you can just to kind of bend it maybe into tune. I can't say we ever successfully did that, but when he was recording it, he insisted on marching around the studio as though he were in a field, you know, we just, you know, we chased him around with the microphone as long as we could. We finally said, "Man, you got to stay in one place because we're, you know, recording this."
I'll never think of the song the same way.
Just like, yeah. But I think "The Wheel of the Sun" is a song that really is, you know, I guess it's a signature song for the record in that it expresses what, to me, the Royal Academy of Reality was about, which was just about poetic reality, and that's what the world of the scene of Wheel of the Sun is kind of about.
Is there something that ideally you hope the listener gets from the experience of hearing the swimming pool cues?
You know, I don't know. You know, I'd like to think that that they got the impression that we were committed, committed artists. You know, and I can't really, you know, think of any single impression that I would try to get across other than that. I mean, I'm really fortunate in that I became associated with such great musicians. You know, Ann is a tremendous singer. Bob Elsey, to me, is one of the greatest guitar players to ever come out of Georgia. And, you know, I didn't really have any of those skills. I had to develop as a guitar player, as a musician. And I didn't really have that kind of a background. We came along at a time when a lot of the people who were in the world that we were moving in were people who didn't have musical backgrounds. When you look at, well, the B-52s, I mean, you know, a tremendous band, but, you know, they really had more of an, you know, art background. Pylon, you know, they were all, in Pylon, they were all artists. And to me, and, you know, they were painterly, or, you know, when you look, Patti Smith, Tom Verlaine, television, Richard Hell, these were people who had more literary intentions, and they just drifted into what they were doing musically, I guess. You know, and that, you know, that's where I came from. And so the only smart decision, I guess, that I made was to be around people who weren't like me. One guy in a band like me is like, you don't need any more guys that can't play. So, you know, I got better, but I was, you know, I mean, the very first record, Robert Schmid plays the drums. He plays bass with the Swimming Pool Cues now. And, you know, he's a great drummer and musician. And, you know, our drummer, Billy Burton, Bill's been with us since 1982. We could never have made any of the records that we did after the Deep End without him. I mean, he's such a tremendously groovy drummer. And he was able to give all of these, what had been my quirkier tendencies of the band, to kind of give it all continuity. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he's still that guy, you know. I mean, it's a remarkably stable lineup. I mean, we've been together over 40 years, and I think it's, by most standards, a remarkably stable lineup. But I would, you know, I want people to know how good I think that they are.
Yeah.
I mean, the Swimming Pool Cues really stood out from the beginning as being capable players and unique musicians. And, you know, I think that's evident, you know, on the recorded material, and when the band performs live, it's, you know, I think it's clear.
What would you credit this longevity to? I mean, it could be said about some bands, here today, gone later today, but the Swimming Pool Cues, 4 decades.
Well, I think a lot of it is the attitude. I mean, we started as most of the groups from the world that we came from were art projects that just got a little bit out of hand and got more and somehow got serious. And that is, where we came. When you look at all of these bands that are, you look at the B-52s, they're still playing. REM, they're still very active musicians. I'm sure the band will be playing again. But you're talking about, all of these groups from that period got together for, what distinguishes the generation that began in the late 1970s in the South, for instance, new creative pop musicians, is that, we got into doing it for artistic reasons and not for reasons that were different from what the prior generation of rock bands got together for. So I think that's really what sustains, you're talking about the longevity, I think that is a large part of what sustains a band like the Swimming Pool Cues or the other artists that I mentioned. It's like that's the reason why we got into it. Not necessarily to be from a glamorous inception. When you're 15 years old and you're in a rock band, you want to be a big star. That's not what, by the time we started as a band, that wasn't what was motivating. It wasn't what was motivating me in any case. I was just, trying to express whatever little ideas that I had lyrically and in as unique a fashion as possible. So I think that plays that's a big part of it. But I'm sure the Who thinks the same thing. That was a band that became a really big, powerful rock band, but that was a band that was that was an art school band. And they've been together for 50 years or more. But I think that's what's plus in the case of the Swimming Pool Cues, you have to know when to kind of let people alone a little bit. You're talking about people growing up becoming adults in a rock music situation. This is not normal, and people have to grow up, and at certain points you have to know to kind of like let them do that and not be, as a band leader, to not be so demanding, on the personalities involved. And that is not easy to do because you're always trying to push things forward. But, you just have to, you can't be yelling at people all the time. You have to make it as pleasant of an experience and as fun of an experience as possible.
What would you say has been the most meaningful compliment you've received as a result of the work that you create?
I'm sure, like most artists, people come up to you and tell you how important that whatever it is that you have done musically has been in their lives, for whatever reason. They've been moved by that in some way. I don't know that you can expect too much more than that.
Yeah.
Really.
It's a huge compliment.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. That people still come to see you perform after so many years means that is something that has, obviously that's happened for, I don't think it's exclusively for nostalgic reasons, but, it's nice.
What is the best thing about being Jeff Calder?
Let me tell you, there's nothing really that great about it. The best thing is that I've just been able to keep doing it and keep being creative. I like to think so anyway. That I'm always I'm able to continually try to reach a little further and try and make whatever it is I'm reaching for a reality. It's not always that, it's not that easy to do that. But, I'm an active person and I enjoy working with other people. So that I'm able to do that, that's just whatever that drive is. That you know what? That's the best thing about being me. To me, is that I'm able to. I still want to do that. Mm-hmm. I still have that belief or feeling.
How would you define Jeff Calder? Who is Jeff Calder?
Just a writer, musician. Nothing's changed for me since I was very little. I liked pop music, clothing, and reading. That was it. Nothing really. That's the thread, that has run through my life. And that I don't think that that's a very practical. You know what? The impracticality of that is that's the real continuity here for me. You know what I mean? It's like, I guess you have to be practical about some things, but that is not a practical pursuit.
Yeah.
And, you find yourself, I think, at varying times, isolated from your peer group and your contemporaries in that kind of a lifestyle. And that's not really that bad, but, that is not the... Most people have more sensible concerns.
Yeah.
And I think, which is good because I like being around people with sensible concerns. It's got regular jobs. I'm envious, the way their lives are structured.
Yeah.
I'm in many ways I'm envious of that, but I don't know if I answered your question, but
you did very, very well, actually. And you really touched on something very interesting. There have been times in my life where I've been pursuing something that's not very practical. And people living very, very practically, who are pursuing very practical things, say, "Oh man, I'm envious of you."
That's right. They want this word.
And I'm thinking, what?
You don't.
You don't want.
You don't want to go down this road.
No. Absolutely. I always like to end the interview. I like to just give the guest the stage. So, in closing, we've been joined by Jeff Calder, the Swimming Pool Cues. What would you say to anyone who's tuned in?
Well, I would say that just to keep tuned in. Because I'm hoping that we are able to release a whole new body of work sometime in the next few years, providing we can get end money to begin, if you follow me, and be able to fund the project. But that's to stay tuned into that, because I think that I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do that.
Wonderful. Jeff Calder, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
Yes.
Ba doodly beep bop dee da dee bumpity boo rapati kanas jip pop kila kanat sa gil bond good tingiga manga but yeah hunger I guess I get back in the woo I got the inga rocket tinga langa bo I can't oh goodbye.